Hello everybody, Pastor Angela here back with another video for our confirmation small groups. This time around we will be talking about the life of the Apostle Paul, who we see very active in the book of Acts. So you have definitely heard me and Pastor Holly and probably Pastor Daryl talk about this Paul guy in the past, but let's talk a little bit more today about who he is and what he did for the Christian church. So we first meet this guy in the book of Acts, and when we meet him, he's going by the name of Saul as opposed to Paul. It's unclear why he goes through this name change. It might have been, back then it was pretty common for Jewish people living in the Roman Empire to have two names, one Roman name and one Jewish name. So that might be the case here. And this guy, Saul, was an early persecutor of the church. He went after new Christians pretty crazily, pretty heavily, and he owns up to it in later writings that come from him. For example, in Philippians 3, he says that he was circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee. All of that basically to say he was this really devout Jewish man and also a leader in the Jewish community. And as these new Christians were popping up, he says, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. As the Christian church was developing and more followers of Christ were popping up, some of the Jewish leaders were getting a little bit uncomfortable because they didn't really think that this Jesus guy had been the Son of God. They were concerned that people were straying from what should have been strict Jewish law and Jewish tradition, and Saul was one of those guys who felt like this new Christian movement needed to be squashed out quickly. So we actually talked about Saul. I think our very first worship this year, this fall, we read from Acts 9, and essentially Saul goes under this big conversion experience. He's on his way to Damascus to, round up some more Christians, and Jesus essentially appears to him in a, big booming voice, knocks him off his horse, and Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Saul then goes blind for 3 days. He's visited by a disciple of Christ called Ananias, who heals him of his blindness. And after this whole ordeal, Saul changes his ways and becomes a Christian. And not just any Christian, he becomes this leader in the church. He becomes a church planter, meaning that he founded a whole bunch of churches throughout the whole Mediterranean region, and he becomes a missionary. He goes around, he goes to all these different cities and tells people about Jesus and about the gospel and about the forgiveness and love that God offers us through Jesus, the Son of God. And he was a missionary especially to what the Bible calls Gentiles, so basically any non-Jewish person. That was kind of his main audience when he was going around doing his missionary work. So Paul takes 4 big trips. We can kind of break them down into 4 big trips over the course of his time as a Christian missionary. So he spent somewhere between 15 and 20 years traveling all around, beginning in like the late 40s. So if you remember, we think that Jesus was crucified and was risen somewhere around the year 30 CE or AD, depending on what you like. And so it was about 20 years later that Paul started his missionary work. And he started from the city of Antioch, which is kind of on the right-hand side of your screen, kind of right on that little bay in the Mediterranean Sea to the north. And first in the purple, you can see he makes kind of a little loop around the area and comes back to Antioch. And then in his second journey in the gold and then his third journey in the green, he takes this big loop throughout the whole Mediterranean. And he does this over the course of many years. he stops, like I said, and plants churches in all these different cities. So he spends a good amount of time in the different cities that he visits. I think the longest that he probably spent in any city was the city of Corinth, which you can see if you can find the country Greece on our map. Right north of where it says Greece on the map, you can see the city of Corinth. He stayed there for about 18 months when he was first planting the church in Corinth. So over the course of really the whole decade of the 50s, he takes these two big loops around the Mediterranean. And just for reference, during Jesus's time, Jesus himself did an awful lot of traveling, but he basically stayed in the area that's boxed in by that little light blue box on the right-hand bottom corner. That's basically all the area that Jesus himself was able to cover in his 3 years of ministry. So Paul takes the gospel and spreads it, 10, 20 times that in terms of area and cities that he visited. So then Paul takes one final fourth journey. He is, towards the end of his ministry, is arrested in the city of Jerusalem, which is in that blue box. And he spends several years under house arrest and in various prisons. Basically, every time that he pleads his case to the person in charge, they kind of move him on right up the totem pole to the next biggest guy in charge, because nobody really knows what to do with him. He's causing a lot of trouble, but he's not really breaking any laws in doing so. So he eventually, as he's working his way up the chain of command here, he gets sent to Rome eventually. He makes it all the way, you can kind of follow that red line, all the way up to Rome in Italy, and he's there for about 2 years before his imprisonment finally comes to an end. The book of Acts ends a little bit ambiguously. Paul might have been able to go on to Spain from Rome and extend his fourth missionary journey, but he also might have actually died in Rome. We're not quite sure exactly what happened to him after he got there. So here's another way of looking at Paul's journeys. This is in the style of a subway map. If you guys have ever gotten to see a map from a subway system or a bus system. And this, I think, is just a little bit easier to read. And it also has these really nice little red letter icons. So you can see kind of in the legend, it says letter recipient, and there's this little icon that looks like a scroll. Well, on this map, this little scroll is next to all of the cities that received letters from Paul that we now have copies of in our Bible. So, for example, I talked about the city of Corinth earlier. The books in our New Testament, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, those are letters from Paul to the church in Corinth as he continues to try and help them from afar and answer their questions and help lead them as they develop as a church. So we are going to talk more later in our confirmation program about these letters, these epistles as we call them in our Bible. But for now, I will just say that know that Paul wrote or is the attributed author of 13 of our 21 epistles in our Bible. And in the Bible, they actually appear in the weirdest order possible. They just arranged them from longest to shortest. So it's a little bit confusing when you come across these books in the Bible because you want them to go in chronological order, but they don't. They just go from the longest letter that Paul wrote to the shortest one. So if we reorder the epistles in terms of when they were written, it looks a little bit more like this. There's a couple that we're not quite sure about, and those are in the brackets, but for the most part, this kind of goes from earliest to latest written letters. Now, I've colored 6 of these in yellow, you can see. Those are the books that say they are written by Paul, but we're actually not quite as sure that they were actually written by Paul, mostly because from Colossians on through Titus, we're pretty confident that they were written after Paul was dead. So it makes it a little bit hard for Paul to have written them. So it's more likely that students of Paul wrote those letters instead of Paul himself. But really, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it really matters, especially considering that, these are all divinely inspired works, and they tell us important things about who God is and how we can live our lives as Christians. All right, so what are our takeaways from the life of Paul? Well, as I said, he started as a persecutor of the new Christian church and had a big conversion experience. Jesus changed his mind, essentially. And Paul then spent 15 to 20 years as a missionary for the gospel. He was responsible for planting dozens of churches throughout the whole Mediterranean region. And something I didn't talk about very much in this video, but something that we have talked about or will talk about when you're in class with me, is that Paul, along with a lot of his fellow missionaries, faced a good amount of imprisonment as well as torture when they came up against various officials in the cities that they were preaching in. The gospel was not a super popular thing in its first, 50 years, well, really in its first 200 years of existence. And so Paul, along with his fellow missionaries, it wasn't just an easy walk into town, talk about the gospel, and everybody agrees with you. It was something that they worked for, that they bled for. And so that's one important thing to remember there. And then finally, Paul was one of the key leaders, not just in church planting, but also in figuring out how we can go about being Christian in our daily lives. And that's one of the big things that we can search for in these epistles that Paul and other apostles wrote in these early years of the church. They had to figure out how to live Christian lives in a world that wasn't used to Christians yet. And that was not an easy thing. So a lot of questions get asked, a lot of mistakes get made, but that's something that we can look for in the epistles if we are ever looking for guidance on that. Well, that is my video for today. We will see you guys soon. I hope you're all staying healthy and staying warm, and we will talk to you soon. All right, thanks, guys.